A compassionate nurse decides to stay late to comfort an elderly, lonely patient, unaware that he's a heartbroken millionaire with a secret. What begins as a simple act of kindness unfolds into a life-changing story filled with unexpected twists, emotional truths, and a reward she never imagined. Elena Morin wasn't supposed to stay late that night. The hospital clock ticked past midnight as a gentle hush fell over the east wing of St. Emery's Care Center. The white linoleum floors gleamed under the dim corridor lights, reflecting faint shadows that danced quietly with every flicker. Most of the nursing staff had clocked out hours ago, leaving behind a skeletal crew in a silence broken only by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the occasional soft squeak of a gurney wheel in the distance. Elena had finished her charting, washed her hands, and collected her bag from the break room. She had every reason to head home. Her shift was long over, but something tugged at her. Room 312. She paused at the hallway corner, her fingers tracing the strap of her bag. She knew the protocol, boundaries, emotional detachment, shift limits. But Elena had never been one to follow only the rule book. Her compass had always been heart-led, and tonight her heart pulled her back. There was a heaviness in the air that night, something unspoken. She could feel it the way some feel oncoming storms in their bones. The patients in room 312 had changed over the years, but the feeling inside that room had always been the same. Unspoken loneliness. And now, it housed a man who, despite his wealth of years, seemed to have nothing left but time and silence. Elena slipped back through the door, her footsteps soft against the floor. Mr. Roland Everhart lay still in his bed, propped up slightly, eyes half open. The pale moonlight filtered through the slatted blinds, casting soft lines across his frail frame. The oxygen hissed gently beside him, blending with the quiet whir of the machines. He didn't turn his head as she entered. Maybe he was asleep, or maybe he had stopped expecting anyone to come. She moved quietly to the small chair beside his bed and sat down, placing a cup of warm chamomile tea on the side table. "Mr. Everhart," she said softly. His eyes fluttered open fully. There was a pause, a flicker of surprise, then recognition. "You're still here," he rasped, voice thin and dry. "I couldn't sleep," she replied with a gentle smile. "Figured I'd check on my favorite night owl." A ghost of a smile passed across his lips. It was faint, but it was there. Elena wasn't sure exactly why Roland Everhart had caught her attention more than most. Maybe it was the way he stared out the window, like he was searching for something he'd lost. Maybe it was the way he hardly spoke unless spoken to, or the fact that his file had no listed emergency contacts. No visitors. No signs of life outside this room. But most likely it was something deeper. Something Elena recognized from her own past. Years ago, she had sat like this beside her own father in an ICU. He hadn't made it through the night. And later, after her mother passed in a similarly quiet hospital bed, Elena had made a promise to herself. No one would die feeling unloved if she could help it. That promise became her purpose. It fueled her long hours, her willingness to take the least desirable shifts, and her ability to smile even on the hardest days. And then there was her broken engagement, a chapter she didn't like to revisit. A future that had once been painted in hopeful tones had unraveled into silence and distance. He had promised forever, and then vanished when life got inconvenient. But rather than grow bitter, Elena had chosen a different path. She turned her grief into grace, her pain into presence. She looked at Roland now, thin, wrinkled skin stretched across trembling hands. A man who once commanded boardrooms and brokered empires, now reduced to machines and memories. But in his faded eyes, she saw more than weakness. She saw history, regret, and perhaps hope. She reached for his hand, her own warm and steady. He didn't resist. His fingers curled around hers weakly, but the connection was real. "I used to sing this song to my mother when she couldn't sleep," Elena whispered. She closed her eyes and hummed along like it took her back to better days. And then she sang, softly like wind through the trees. Just a lullaby, a tune passed down from mother to daughter, notes that lingered in the corners of the room, more effective than any sedative. As she sang, Roland's breathing eased. His eyes, which had been clouded with the fog of fatigue, found clarity. His lips lifted at the corners. It was the first real smile she had seen from him since his admission. Outside, the city slept. But in room 312, something stirred, a moment of peace, a breath of connection. Elena stayed by his side long after the song ended, her hand still in his. And in that quiet room, surrounded by machines and shadows, a seed of something extraordinary began to take root. There was a time when Roland Everhart's name carried weight. In his prime, he commanded attention the moment he entered a room. His presence was sharp, magnetic, impossible to ignore. He built his fortune not just through strategy, but with a voice people trusted and a mind that never stopped calculating the next move. Deals were sealed with his firm handshake, and laughter often echoed in the grand dining halls of his estate, where guests toasted to his wisdom and wit. But empires fade, and so do echoes. Now, his world had been stripped down to 4 white walls, a stiff hospital bed, and the faint antiseptic smell that clung to everything. The silence that surrounded him was not just quiet, it was suffocating. Not a single visitor had stepped into room 312 since his admittance. Not a single phone call or handwritten note to remind him that he mattered. The truth was, Roland had pushed people away long before they stopped coming. He had spent decades prioritizing ambition, thinking there would always be time to mend what ambition had broken. But time had proven to be an unkind ally. The person who haunted him most in that silence was his son, Vincent. They hadn't spoken in 6 years. Their last conversation had been a bitter crescendo of resentment and pain. Vincent had accused him of being cold, of valuing business over family. Roland had fired back with harsh words about irresponsibility and entitlement. Neither man had meant to destroy the bridge between them, but the fire lit by that argument had burned it to ash. In the aftermath, pride had kept them apart. Now, as Roland lay in the pale wash of hospital light, he thought often of that final fight, of the words he could never unsay. The pain wasn't just in his lungs, though they burned with every breath. It was in his chest, deeper, quieter, a heart heavy with what-ifs. And then there was Elena. She had become a gentle disruption to his routine of solitude. Her footsteps, light and sure, announced her arrival long before her voice ever did. She never barged in. She entered like one with a chapel, calm, respectful, with reverence for the stillness. She didn't speak to him like a task to be checked off a chart. She asked questions with genuine curiosity. Where did you grow up, Mr. Everhart? What was your wife like? Did you ever dance under stars? At first, Roland answered with caution, offering only vague nods and half-hearted responses. But Elena had patience and kindness. It was a kind that didn't demand trust. It earned it. Over the course of days, his responses grew into stories. His voice, hoarse but steady, found new purpose in reminiscing. He spoke of Mara, his wife of 43 years, her laugh that could melt his anger, her garden that she tended like a sanctuary. He remembered their secret road trips, their shared coffee at sunrise, the lullabies she used to sing to their infant son. He told Elena things he hadn't said aloud in decades. What struck him most was how she listened, not with pity, but with presence. She didn't flinch at his labored coughs or look away when he struggled for breath. Instead, she leaned in, eyes steady, as if to say, "I'm here. You're not invisible." And for the first time in a very long time, Roland felt seen. In Elena, he saw what he had lost, not just companionship, but connection, a human tether to a world that had slowly let go of him. He began to look forward to her visits, not because she brought tea or adjusted his pillows, but because she brought warmth, a warmth that reached places medicine couldn't. In the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, she was his audience, his confidant, and, though he wouldn't admit it yet, his friend. Each night she stayed past her shift. Something small shifted in him. A dormant part of his spirit began to stir, the part that remembered what it felt like to laugh, to share, to love. He didn't know how to express his gratitude. He wasn't a man of sentimental words. But once, when she fluffed his pillow and turned to leave, he caught her hand and held it just for a moment. Their eyes met. He nodded. It was all he could give. But Elena understood, and in that fleeting silence between them, something more powerful than words was exchanged, an unspoken promise that he wasn't alone anymore. Elena Morin had never planned to become anything more than a caretaker in Mr. Roland Everhart's life. She was a nurse, a night shift fixture in a place designed more for healing bodies and soothing hearts. But somewhere between adjusting his foreline and fluffing his pillows, something unspoken had begun to form, a delicate thread of connection, barely visible but undeniably strong. It wasn't the kind of bond you announce. It didn't need declarations or grand gestures. It simply grew, quietly, like ivy curling up an old stone wall, rooted in shared silences and unspoken understanding. Each night, Elena found herself staying a little longer, even after her shift ended. It started with small things. She brought him old books of poetry, Yeats, Frost, Neruda, poets who spoke of love and longing and the ache of memory. Roland, who once dismissed poetry as flowery nonsense, began to request it. His favorite was a faded anthology she'd inherited from her mother, its pages brittle with time and use. Sometimes she read aloud. Sometimes they just sat. No words, no pressure, just a rhythmic click of the clock and the hush of hospital stillness. Roland didn't need constant chatter. He appreciated the rare gift of someone who could sit in silence and not make it feel empty. On the fourth evening, as twilight melted into deep night, he broke their quiet with a question that lingered in the air like incense. "Elena," he said, his voice rasping through the stillness, "do you believe in second chances?" She looked up from the book in her lap, startled not by the question but by the weight behind it. "I don't just believe in them," she said after a thoughtful pause. "I live for them." Her voice was steady, but her eyes carried the quiet ache of someone who had rebuilt herself more than once. Roland studied her, and for a moment the tough businessman's facade crumbled. His eyes shimmered, not just from age or illness, but from something deeper. A single tear traced down his weathered cheek, disappearing into lines of face that had seen too much and held too much in. "I made mistakes," he whispered. "Big ones. And now, I don't know if it's too late." Elena reached out and gently rested her hand on his. "It's never too late to try," she said. That night, just before she left, Roland asked her to do something he hadn't asked of anyone in years. "Find my son," he said softly, barely above a whisper. "Vincent, I want to see him." Elena hesitated only for a breath. She didn't press for details or promises. She simply nodded. Vincent Everhart hadn't heard his father's name spoken out loud in years, not without the sting of resentment clinging to it. To the outside world, the Everharts had once seemed like a perfect family, wealthy, respected, poised. But behind the closed doors of their glass-walled home, affection had always felt like a transaction. Their final conversation had been a storm. Shouted words, old wounds reopened, accusations hurled with surgical precision. Roland had called Vincent aimless. Vincent had called his father heartless. The silence that followed had lasted over 6 years. When the hospital called, Vincent almost let it go to voicemail. Something in him clenched at the sound of the nurse's voice. Elena's voice, gentle but direct. She didn't beg or plead. She simply said, "He asked for you." Vincent hung up without replying, but the words haunted him. He didn't sleep that night. Memories flooded his mind. His father helping him with math homework as a child, the smell of cigars and expensive cologne, the disappointment in his father's eyes the day he dropped out of business school. Regret had always been easier to ignore than to confront, but now it stood squarely in front of him. The next evening, Vincent stood outside room 312. He wore a tailor coat and carried a small bouquet of forget-me-nots, Amara's favorite. The hallway was quiet. His heart thudded in his chest like it was trying to escape. Part of him feared the man inside wouldn't recognize him. A bigger part feared that he would, and wouldn't forgive him. He hovered for a long moment, hand resting on the doorknob, staring at the small plaque bearing his father's name. Behind it, time was slipping away. Was there still space to heal what had fractured so long ago? Vincent didn't know, but the voice of a stranger had reached him, a nurse who had stayed by his father's side when no one else did. And maybe that meant there was still hope. With a slow breath, he turned the handle. Vincent's first visit wasn't the cinematic reunion that some might imagine. There were no shouted regrets, No tearful embraces, no sudden resolutions. It was quiet, uncomfortable, even. Two men, once bound by blood and now separated by years of silence, faced each other like strangers. Roland looked older than Vincent remembered. His father's once imposing frame had thinned, his skin paper-like and pale, eyes sunken but sharp. There was a pause, a moment of stunned stillness. When their eyes met, Vincent wasn't sure if it was recognition or just surprise. But Roland gave a slight nod, and that was enough to let him in. Elena remained in the room, sensing the fragile tension between them. She didn't hover, but she didn't leave either. Instead, she sat near the window, folding linens or quietly checking Roland's vitals. Her presence wasn't intrusive. It was grounding. She acted not as a buffer, but as a subtle guide, gently offering small bits of conversation to bridge the vast silence between father and son. "Your father's been enjoying poetry lately," she said at one point, glancing up from her work. "He has quite the taste for Yeats." Vincent raised an eyebrow. "Yeats? Since when?" Roland, with a weak smile, muttered, "Since your mother forced it on me for 30 years. Thought I hated it. Turns out I just never listened close enough. It wasn't much, but it was something, a shared memory, a flicker of light." The visit ended with a quiet goodbye and no promises of return. But Vincent did return, and then again, and again. Over the next several days, the coldness that once surrounded their conversations began to thaw. The moments were still awkward, still filled with hesitation and careful words. But slowly, cautiously, they began to reach for each other. Roland, propped up in his bed with a pillow behind his back, started sharing stories that had long gathered dust in his memory. Stories of his early days in business, of nights he danced with Mara in the living room after Vincent had gone to bed, of fears he never voiced and mistakes he never acknowledged. Vincent, who had spent much of his adult life convinced that his father never really knew him, listened, truly listened. For the first time, he heard more in the tremble of Roland's voice than he ever had in all the arguments they'd shared. He saw the vulnerability in his father's eyes, the way he looked at Elena for support, the way he reached for her hand when he couldn't find the right words. It was in those silent moments between spoken memories, between a glance and a breath, that something deeper began to shift. Forgiveness didn't arrive all at once, and it didn't come with fanfare. It crept in like dawn, soft, gradual, barely noticeable at first. Just a little more light every day. Elena became the thread that quietly wove them back together. She never pried. She never pushed. But she knew when to stay and when to step out, when to let silence speak, and when to gently prompt a question like, "Vincent, did your father ever tell you about the old record player he kept hidden in the library?" Her intuition was subtle, but it was powerful. She created space where pride could loosen its grip, where regret could be named without shame, where healing could take root. Vincent started bringing small things with him. Photographed from his childhood, Amara's favorite music on an old USB stick, even the faded chessboard they used to play on when he was a boy. Roland would smirk and say, "You still cheat, don't you?" And Vincent would respond with, "Only when I want to win." One afternoon, Elena walked in to find them playing a game. The pieces were scattered, and neither seemed entirely clear on the rules. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the laughter. Soft and unsteady, but real. The sound of two men trying to build something new from the pieces of what had once been broken. Time is a curious thing in a hospital. Some days stretch endlessly, marked by routines and quiet footsteps, while others vanish in the blink of an eye. For Roland Everhart, time had begun to lose its edges. His body grew more fragile with each passing day, the illness draining strength from his limbs even as something within him seemed to brighten. It was as if, sensing the end, his spirit chose to rise rather than fade. In those final days, Roland was no longer just a patient confined to room 312. He became something more, a father trying to make peace, a man trying to leave behind meaning where there had once been only wealth and silence. He talked more openly, smiled more freely, and on occasion, even joked. Dry wit, of course, always delivered with that particular Everhart sharpness. Elena remained by his side through it all, her presence as constant as the moonlight that gently poured through the blinds each night. She didn't treat him like a man dying. She treated him like a man living, right up to the very end. She brought him music when his voice became too weak to speak. She held his hand during the harder nights, sitting silently when sleep eluded him, humming softly when words failed. Vincent, too, became a daily visitor, no longer hesitant. He came with purpose now. Sometimes they spoke at length. Other times they just sat together in quiet reflection. It no longer mattered what wasn't said years ago. What mattered was now. Forgiveness had taken root, and in that space, love returned, not as a wave, but as a tide rising slowly, reclaiming the shore. One evening, Roland handed Vincent a sealed envelope. His hands trembled slightly, but his gaze was steady. "When the time comes," he said, "read it aloud. Promise me." Vincent swallowed hard and nodded. "I promise." That evening came sooner than anyone expected. It was a quiet night. The sky beyond a window, a rich velvet blue, dusted with stars. The machines in Roland's room hummed a familiar lullaby, their rhythm steady, almost tender. Elena sat beside him, his hand gently cradled in hers, while Vincent read aloud by the warm bedside lamp. The letter was written in Roland's own hand, slightly shaky, but unmistakably his. "To my future grandchildren," it began, "I may not live to meet you, but know that you are already loved." The letter was filled with stories, some humorous, some wise, and all deeply personal. He wrote of Mara and their early days, of the mistakes he made as a father, of the lessons he hoped would be passed down. There were no grand declarations, only honest truths and tender wishes for the generations that might follow him. By the time Vincent reached the final words, Roland's breathing had slowed, and then, without warning, it stopped. No gasp, no struggle, just stillness. Elena's hand remained in his as she leaned forward, gently brushing a lock of hair from his brow. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. Vincent bowed his head, pressing the letter against his chest, the weight of loss softened only by the peace that filled the room. Roland Everhart had not died alone. He had not died in bitterness or regret. He had left this world surrounded by the very things he thought he had lost: connection, reconciliation, love. The funeral was held 3 days later in a quiet countryside chapel surrounded by cypress trees. The air was cool, the sun gentle as it filtered through the stained glass windows. The service was simple, just as Roland had requested. No fanfare, no spectacle, just family, a few close friends, and the people who would come to know him in his final days. Elena stood in the back, dressed in a soft gray dress, hands folded in front of her. She didn't speak during the service, but her presence was felt. Vincent spoke on behalf of the family, sharing memories of his father not as a titan of industry, but as a man trying to make things right before the end. And when he mentioned Elena, his voice caught slightly. "There was a time when I thought I'd never understand my father," he said. "And then someone came along who saw the best in him, even when he couldn't see it himself." After the burial, the will was read in private. Vincent was expecting a straightforward distribution. His father had never been one for surprises, but what he heard stunned him. Just 1 week before his death, Roland had made changes. In the updated document, Elena Morin was not only named, she had been entrusted with a portion of the estate. But it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the purpose. To Nurse Elena Morin, the letter from the lawyer read, "I leave this gift in gratitude, and with the hope that you will use it to fulfill your calling, to build a place where no soul will ever be left to face the end alone." The gift was enough to fund the beginnings of something extraordinary. A hospice care center, not a sterile clinical space, but a sanctuary, a place of light, music, dignity, and presence. A place where silence was peaceful, not painful, where goodbyes were softened by warmth and love. The name for it came easily: the Everhart Light Center, a beacon for those whose journeys were nearing their end. A tribute to a man who found peace not through wealth, but through human connection. Time has a way of softening sorrow. Months passed after Roland's funeral, but his memory remained fresh in the lives of those he had touched, especially in the hearts of Vincent and Elena. What had started as nightly visits in a quiet hospital room slowly evolved into something deeper, quieter, and more enduring. Vincent and Elena didn't fall into a whirlwind romance. There were no grand gestures, no breathless decorations. Instead, there was understanding between two people who had both known loss, who had both stood at the edge of grief and found each other waiting on the other side. They began meeting for coffee outside the hospital, often late in the evening, after the world had quieted. Sometimes they spoke about Roland. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. Their connection was not built on drama, but on presence, on sitting in silence and feeling seen. Vincent admired Elena's steadiness, her kindness that was never performative, her ability to carry the weight of others' sorrow without losing herself in it. And Elena saw in Vincent not just the son of a once powerful man, but someone who had chosen humility, who had been brave enough to return when it would have been easier to walk away. One soft spring evening, as the sky turned the color of rose petals, Vincent took Elena to his mother's garden, a quiet space behind the old Everhart estate where Amara used to tend her roses each morning. Though slightly overgrown, the garden still breathed with her memory. There, beneath a blooming arch of white roses, Vincent knelt, not in dramatic fashion, but with quiet conviction. "I don't want a perfect future," he told her. "I just want a real one, with you." Elena's answer was simple and sure. They married in a modest ceremony that summer. No velvet aisle runners or lavish displays, just laughter, music, and the people whose lives have been shaped by the story of a nurse who stayed late and a father who asked for a second chance. The reception was held outdoors, the garden now restored with fresh blooms. Guests sipped tea and told stories beneath twinkling lights, many of them former patients or caregivers who had known Roland, and now knew the love that grew from his final days. Shortly after the wedding, Elena and Vincent launched the Everhart Light Foundation, an initiative not rooted in wealth or status, but in memory, compassion, and a deep belief that every person deserves dignity in their final chapter. It wasn't named for Roland's legacy of business, but for the light he had found in his final days, the light Elena had brought into his darkest moments. The Everhart Light Foundation grew steadily, becoming a sanctuary for the forgotten. It was a place where terminal patients with no family could spend their final days wrapped in warmth, not wires. Here, music drifted through open windows. Dogs curled up beside beds. Laughter was just as welcome as tears. Elena oversaw every detail. She walked the halls with purpose, checking in with patients, comforting grieving families, training staff with the kind of empathy that couldn't be taught in classrooms. She remembered names, birthdays, even favorite songs. Each resident was treated not as a case, but as a life, full, beautiful, worthy of love until the very end. Vincent handled the operational side, fundraising, logistics, outreach, but his favorite days were still the quiet ones. We sat at someone's bedside with a book in hand, reading aloud just as he had for his father. Sometimes he read poetry, other times just a newspaper, but always he read with care. Together, they turned a man's final days into a beginning for so many others. And in every hallway of the foundation, in every sunlit room, there lingered the spirit of Roland Everhart, not as a name etched in marble, but as a presence woven into the very fabric of the place. The man who once lived alone and afraid had, in the end, become the reason others would not have to. As for the nurse who once stayed late, she had become the heart of a movement, a quiet light in the lives of so many. Her story, simple as it was, proved one powerful truth, that even the smallest act of compassion can illuminate the darkest night, that one kind choice can echo far beyond its moment, and that love, real selfless love, is never wasted. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more deeply moving tales of compassion, connection, and second chances. Because sometimes the smallest stories are the ones that change us the most.